All our shurim this year are in memory of Elisheva Frist, Elisheva Sima, Bat Zalman, Zechronah Livracha, and the Kadosh Baruch Hu should also incorporate the schut of our learning to the all the chayalim should come home b'shalom, all the chatufim should come home b'shalom, and we should be able to end this milchama letovat am Yisrael b'shalom. I'm going to introduce a book today of I wouldn't call him a colleague in any way or manner. He's just so far head and shoulders above most. Some of you from the old city probably know who I'm talking about. Rabbi Professor Daniel Sperva, who is, you don't know Daniel Sperva? He used to be in the old city. He used to live in Katamon, then he moved to the old city. Daniel Sperva, Professor Daniel Sperva, is a seasoned Talmud Chacham. He has, he's not, I wouldn't call him an absolute centrist, a little bit sometimes to the left in some of his liberal attitudes, but he's perfectly halachic, and that's why some people think he's dangerous, because he's so halachic and so knowledgeable, and if he says something, you don't have to agree with it, but at least you have to take it seriously. I mean, he says things that have a basis. And he wrote a book in English many years ago called On Changes in Jewish Liturgy, Options and Limitations, where he also discusses the idea that from the days of Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the authoring of the Shmoneh Esrei, things were supposed to be very, very constant. And I mentioned just a few weeks ago that from the 19 brachot that we have today in Shmoneh Esrei, the only one that does not have a different nusach in terms of language is the bracha of tshuva. Hashivenu b'no Toratecha. I literally checked many different nuschaot, and they all have it the same. But every other bracha has some type of a variant in nusach, which is a function of the galut. It's a function of the fact that we lost touch with a central halachic authority, and therefore different communities sometimes made alterations, or mistakes may have crept into a manuscript and it became altered, and this is what we have. God willing, there'll be a Sanhedrin, they'll be able to put it back together, and then everybody is going to daven the same nusach. And I can tell you now that until we get out of our heads the psychological edge of the nusach of your grandfather, it's not going to happen. There is a lot of psychology here, and I can tell you from the field of Rabbanut for so many years that if somebody asks a shaila in halacha and you tell the person no, you can't do it, you can't eat it, whatever, if the person has enough yirat shamayim, they'll accept it, and as simple as that. But if they ask something that has to do with minhag, then you have to be hyper careful. Minhag is much less of a serious subject matter in Torah than a halacha. Yet, when it comes to minhag, it hits your ego, hits your identity. It's you. It's you and your family and so on. So, if the Bubba did it this way, don't tell me to do it some other way. And this has to be really catered to. So much so that with regard to Nusach HaTfilah in general, in shuls, so there is a concept that a shul, Kehila, has a Nusach, except that here in Eretz Yisrael, with the emergence of new communities all the time, and you get 11 people moving into the neighborhood, the first ones to move in, 6 daven Ashkenaz, 5 daven Sfard. So what does that mean? It's going to be Ashkenaz now until Yemot HaMashiach, when there will be maybe 5,000 families in this yeshuv, or every year we'll take a vote again, depending on how many new people moved in. So there are many communities that decided not to decide, and that the chazan of any particular tefillah determines whether it's going to be this nusach or that nusach. If you're not familiar with it, people coming from Chutz La'aretz, it's a headache. But when you get used to it, It's as simple as that. And everybody seems to be happier. In my humble opinion, as much as I'm a stickler for nusach hatfilah in a shul, I think if the option is to bust up the kehila and make 2 shuls, I'd rather have the mishmash of the nusach in shul than a busted up community. Even though Rabbi Avad Yosef wrote that there's halachic justification to split the shul on if the issue is the nusach. He didn't say you should do it, but he said if you do it, you're not in violation of what's called Lo Titgodedu. Lo Titgodedu is a pasuk in Sefer Dvarim that has something to do with avelut, that we shouldn't scratch ourselves and draw blood in mourning. Lo Titgodedu v'lo tosimu korcha bein einechem lemet. You shouldn't rip out your hair, for those who still have some hair. But Chazal explained the word gedud from the word aguda, lo tasu agudot agudot. It means don't make different communities. If you have one community, keep it as a unified community. And there are things that we have to be careful for lo titgodedu, that you're not allowed to do something that's running against the stream of the entire community. So I'll just give you a nice example of it. There is a machloket, a dispute, bona fide machloket, between Chachmei Ashkenaz and Chachmei Sfarad, if we are to wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. So, it's Chol HaMoed. Is it more Moed than Chol, or more Chol than Moed? So I remember in America, people used to think that, well, if I'm still working, and a lot of people would go to work on Chol HaMoed, so me, it's working, so I put on tefillin. When I retire, I stop putting on tefillin. That's utter nonsense, I must tell you. Utter nonsense. It has to do with how much Kedushat Yom there is to Chol HaMoed. So according to the Chachmei Sfarad, Chol HaMoed is Yom Tov, even though you are permitted to do certain things on Chol HaMoed. But as Yom Tov, we don't wear tefillin, so we don't wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. But the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserles, was of the opinion that it's weekday. It's basically weekday and does not have that level of Kedushat Hayom. And therefore, it's more parallel to Rosh Chodesh. So on Rosh Chodesh, while we may take off the tefillin by Musaf, which is exactly what people who wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed do, take off the tefillin by Musaf, but we put on tefillin. The point is, it's a midday that we put on tefillin on Rosh Chodesh, so we put on tefillin for those who put on tefillin on Chol HaMoed, according to Rabbeinu Tam. Now, I grew up in a house in Chutz La'aretz where we didn't wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. Why? Because not everybody, not all communities held like the Ramah, which is interesting. Not everybody held like Ramah. The Vilna Gaon, thoroughbred Ashkenazi, without a doubt, identified with the Sephardi point of view and said that there's Kedushat Yom, sanctity of the day, on Chol HaMoed, and therefore no tefillin. And that view filters down to the Volozhina yeshiva, which then impacted on Brisk and other yeshivot. So what we call the yeshiva world now has already branched out to adopting the minhag of not wearing tefillin on Chol HaMoed. The Hasidim in Eastern Europe, who were Kabbalists, many of them were into Kabbalah, so they followed Rabbi Yosef Karo, who was a Kabbalist as well, and Rabbi Yosef Karo said there's no tefillin on Chol HaMoed. So now you have groupings of Ashkenazim, whether it's Litvaks, from the yeshiva world, whether it's Hasidim in Eastern Europe, in Poland and Russia or Hungary, not wearing tefillin. So who's wearing tefillin on Chol HaMoed? The Litvaks, who are really not part of that world, Misnagdim, who are not part of the Vilna Gaon orbit, and the Western European Jews, German Jews, and so on, Yekis and so on, they wore tefillin on Chol HaMoed. So the country was, the world, the Jewish world was divided. What happens in America? Balagan. I mean, Rav Moshe Feinstein said, everybody brought to America in their suitcase their minhag. So there is no minhag America on the subject. It's whatever you do. And therefore, he said, there's no problem in one shul for half the minyan to wear tefillin, half the minyan not to wear tefillin, because there's no minhag, he said. And there's no minhag of the kihilot in Chutz La'aretz to wear tefillin or not to wear tefillin. But in Eretz Yisrael, the situation is different. Because the situation here, in the 16th century, with the arrival of Rabbi Yosef Karo, who were the Jews here in Eretz Yisrael? They were predominantly those who fled from the Spanish Inquisition. Now, Rabbi Yosef Karo was born 3 or 4 years before the Inquisition. He was born in 1488, or 1489. So he's 3 years old at the time of the Girush. But he didn't make it here in an El Al flight from Barcelona. They didn't have it then yet. Or there was an El Al strike that day, perhaps, I don't know. But you had to go through Italy and then Greece and Saloniki and Turkey. It became years. But he finally makes it, and he makes it to Tzfat. And he for sure impacts on whoever here is in Eretz Yisrael, to the extent that Rav Avadia Yosef Zatzal believes that every Oleh Chadash automatically becomes a Sephardi because Rabbi Yosef Karo was the Rav HaMakom, was the Marad Adra. And he says, well, if you want to continue with your Ashkenazi custom, yesh al mi lismoch, you have upon who to rely on. But he believed that every Jew who comes in Aliyah automatically switches and becomes a Sephardi. Though that view never made it, never really caught on, certainly not amongst Ashkenazim. The Sephardim loved that psak, but the Ashkenazim never bought into it. But Rabbi Yosef Karo's minhag was not to wear tefillin Chol Hamoed. 200 years later, you have the arrival of Ashkenazim in Eretz Yisrael almost at the same time, but in two different waves. Wave number one was the students of the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon actually started out for Eretz Yisrael and had to turn back for whatever circumstance, but he does send some of his prime students to Eretz Yisrael. One of them is the Rivlin family. We had a president of Israel who was a great-great-great-great-grandson of the Rivlins, and the Solomon family who from Yerushalayim moved to Petach Tikva. These are all the Prushim were known as. Rav Sonnenfeld was part of this in Shari Chesed area of Yerushalayim. That's where you have the Shul of the Grot, of the Vilna Gaon. So this was a group of Talmidim of the Vilna Gaon who brought over the minhag of the Vilna Gaon not to wear tefillin on Chol Hamoed. Fine, say now you have Ashkenazim here not wearing tefillin on Chol Hamoed. You have Sephardim here not wearing tefillin on Chol Hamoed. And then you have the Hasidic movement moving over from Europe here. And it came by the brother-in-law of the Baal Shem Tov, who's known as Rabbi Avraham Gershon from Kitov, known more popularly as Rabbi Gershon Kitova. And the reason that my grandfather was named Gershon Adler, Zichron Livracha, because we are direct descendants of this Rabbi Gershon Kitova, Ben Achar Ben. Now I explained it to my daughter. I said that's worth a lot of money on the shidduch market, and my kids told me, "Abba ze lo funktia." It doesn't. They didn't care. Can you imagine such apikosim? I mean, this is a lot of function. You're going to go walk around with yichus, They are Maimonidean in nature. Yichus doesn't play a role at all. So Reb Gershon Kitova comes, he was sent by the Baal Shem Tov to Eretz Yisrael to spread Chassidut. So what do you have now? You have another grouping of Ashkenazim from Europe not wearing tefillin and Chol Hamoed, and the students of Vilna Gaon not wearing tefillin and Chol Hamoed, and the Sephardim who were here. So it was a coalition. There was nobody wearing tefillin and Chol Hamoed. That becomes the minhag in Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, an Oleh Chadash, who may have worn tefillin for 60 years in Chutz La'aretz, comes on Aliyah, there is no need for hatarat nedarim. Normally, if you change a minhag, it's like a vow, you have to disavow a neder. You don't have to do that. It's an automatic shift because you're moving from a place of mokum shenagu, the place where this was the minhag, to a place where that's the minhag, and it's an order, and you permanently want to live here, so you stop wearing tefillin on Chol Hamoed. And that's the deal. The only question comes up with regard to tourists. Tourists, and Baruch Hashem, we have tourists here for Yom Tov and so on. So, a tourist who's here and will put on tefillin in shul is in violation of a biblical offense of lo titgodadu, of lo tasu agudot agudot. So if the tourist wants to wear his tefillin in his hotel room for a few minutes and say Shema, or at his home where he's staying, there's no aveira. He can do that. There's no question he can do that. And according to some poskim, not even to make a bracha on it, but that's a different question, the bracha. But to put on the tefillin, he can do it, but it has to be private. Now, I had two situations, once in Ramot, when I was the rabbi there, where a 16-year-old was wearing tefillin and Chol Hamoed. I walked over him quietly on the side. I said, buddy, you got to take off your tefillin here. So he starts arguing with me that this is his minhag. I said, I understand it's your minhag and all that, but you see, you don't wear tefillin in Eretz Yisrael. And he's still, as they say, bishalo, he's still with his point. I said, listen, I'll tell you what the minhag in this shul is. The minhag is that when the rabbi tells you to take off the tefillin, first you take off the tefillin, and then you ask, why did I do that? That's the minhag in the shul. So first take off your tefillin, then I'll patiently explain. Then I once had in one of the hotels, when I was there for Chol Hamoed, I saw a tourist from England, and he was wearing tefillin. There were 300 people in this ulam. So I said, did you notice that nobody here is wearing tefillin? Did you take note? He says, I was wondering why everybody forgot their tefillin this morning. It was pretty good. It's almost like a David Levy joke. Yeah.
If the minhag is so strong, what happens on Yom Tov Sheni when people from Chutz La'aretz, they have a choice? Oh, Yom Tov Sheni or no Yom Tov Sheni?
Yeah, a choice. It means, there's a big machloket on what a tourist should be doing here in Eretz Yisrael and Yom Tov Sheni, but according to the view that a tourist here who's going back, which according to some that's an Isur, to think that Rav Shmuel Salant, who was the Rav of Yerushalayim, Paskin, in the 19th century, said that it's Asur to even think that you're going back to Chutz La'aretz. So even if you do go back to Chutz La'aretz, but on Yom Tov Sheni, it doesn't exist. You have to keep one day. But all right, that's a shir in itself. But then a person should put on tefillin privately. There, the person is going to keep Yom Tov Sheni, so there, he's not going to put on tefillin at all. We have Isur Chag at the end of Sukkot.
I'm talking about the issue of Yom Tov Sheni. Goes around, like a peacock, okay, I'm Yom Tov Sheni and go already home.
So the truth of the matter is he shouldn't do that at all, because you're not supposed to make yourself conspicuous that you're even keeping Yom Tov Sheni. Now I know sometimes I drive to Ramat Eshkol to visit my mother on the Isru Chag, and there it's like full of koilel guys from the Mir who live in Ramat Eshkol, and you see it's good Yom Tov, good Yom Tov, good Yom Tov. You see it. I know. Rav Kook was of the opinion that it is forbidden to have a Yom Tov Sheni minyan in Eretz Yisrael because it's farhesia. You're not allowed to do things to be farhesia in Yom Tov Sheni. So everything has to be b'tzin'ah. So you said a minyan, by definition, is farhesia. So if you want to daven weekday davening, do it on your own, b'tzin'ah. But what? If you want to daven Yom Tov davening, do it on your own, right? Everything. Sure.
And they forsake the putting on tefillin.
Again, somebody who has a shita, I'm not here to challenge that. But I'm just saying is that Rav Kook said you're not allowed to make a public display about going against the minhag of Eretz Yisrael in this case, and certainly in shul to put on tefillin or chol hamoed in Eretz Yisrael is lo titgo to do. You're not allowed to do that. But there are other things that we are allowed to do because there's no defined minhag. So I'm going to get back to Rabbi Shperva in this particular book, Daniel Shperva, who is a laureate of Pras Yisrael in this country for his unbelievable research on the subject of minhag. It's an 8-volume series called Minhagei Yisrael, and then he put this out in English on Nusach HaTfilah. I'd like to discuss specifically the issue of the censorship that entered into the picture in the printing of Sifrei Kodesh in general and Sidurim in particular. So let's look at source number 7 on the page towards the bottom. And it says, source number 7 is from the Rambam's Seder HaTfilah. The Rambam has, he wrote the Siddur at the end of Hilchot Tfilah, which is a very nice thing to do. And it begins with, La Malshinim al Tihi Tikva. It so happens, the Rambam never wrote that phrase, La Malshinim. La Malshinim means those who snitch, those who talk. The assumption was that there were either Jews who went to Roman authorities and squealed on them and so on. That's called a malshin, right? In slang in Hebrew, it's called a shtinker. So that's what it's called, a shtinker, but a squealer. So what did the Rambam actually write? So we know from the manuscripts of the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam, he wrote La Mishumadim. What is the word shmad? Shin mem daled. What does shmad mean? So shmad has one general connotation. It has something to do with goyim doing bad to Jews. That's for sure. So on the one hand, it's related to Christianity throughout the generations trying to coerce us to accept Christianity, to baptize. So they were called shmad. And unfortunately, throughout history, there were no small number of Jews who did adopt Christianity. When we talk about the Spanish Inquisition, so there was an option given. You could accept Christianity and baptize, and then you were just left alone. So how many Jews opted for baptism? I'm not talking about Marranos now. Marranos are those who baptize but maintain some semblance of Judaism in the tunnels, underground. Most of them, at the end of the day, stayed Christian. Some survived until this very day as Marranos. But the overwhelming majority of Spanish Jewry, I'm talking about 60%, 60% is a tremendous amount, outright baptized. So there were, nobody's going to fault them because it was under the threat of death, but that's what happened. So we suffered from shmad on this level. There's the Medrash that says on Yaakov Avinu, V'hu tzolea al Yerecho, that after his encounter with the man, the Ish, who's identified in the Midrash as the spiritual representation of Esav, the Sar Shel Esav. So what does it mean? What's the symbolism that he walks away limping? So the Midrash says, Elu Dorot Hashmad. These reflect the generations of the lost Nishamot. Right? Shomer Yisrael, Shmor She'erit Yisrael. Not only we ask Kadosh Baruch Hu to guard Am Yisrael, but there are remnants. The remnants of Am Yisrael. Right? The Bnei Menashe in India that were brought over. Remnants of Am Yisrael out there. Moranos, the president of Portugal, by the way, probably is a Morano, from Morano family today. There are a lot of Moranos in Portugal, a lot of Moranos who survived in Portugal. So the She'erit Yisrael, Shmor She'erit Yisrael, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the shul, the Spanish-Portuguese shul in Manhattan is called Kankilat She'erit Yisrael. I think that's the name of the shul, even. It's a remnant of Am Yisrael. This was the Meshumadim, but also the word Shmad means being killed by Goyim. In other words, you're being killed because you're Jewish. That's also an act of Shmad that Chazal talked about. And I'll prove it. We know that during the days of the Omer, so Ashkenazim, more so than Sfardim, but Sfardim on a certain level, have a period of mourning. It's not a full-blown period of mourning, but there are things that we don't do because of lowering the bar on Simcha. The Rambam doesn't even know about this. As far as I know, he was Jewish and religious. There are all kinds of things the Rambam doesn't have in the Mishnah Torah, which already tells you these are not things that were widespread or even hit North Africa for him to even know about. He may not even known about it. It's not there at all. The Rambam doesn't have Lag Baimer, and the Rambam doesn't have Bar Mitzvah. My gosh, was he Jewish? And that already says something about the formation of the development of minhag in Am Yisrael. The first time Bar Mitzvahs was celebrated, Bar Mitzvah was the 16th century in Lublin by the Maharshal. Before that, there was no such a halachic animal called celebrating a Bar Mitzvah. And celebrating a Bat Mitzvah is at the turn of the century with feminism, by the way. There's no Rav that ever received a shaila in the 16th or 17th, 18th century about Bat Mitzvah. But in the 20th century, all of a sudden, Rav Moshe Feinstein's writing about it, Rav Avadia, they're all writing about it, because it became a subject, became an issue. But Bar Mitzvah, Rambam never heard of Bar Mitzvah. Doesn't mean you don't become a Bar Mitzvah, but they never celebrated. It wasn't something that was on the calendar, on the agenda. So the Rambam doesn't know about a mourning period in the days of the Omer. But what do you mean? The Gemara talks about from Pesach until Shavuot, the students of Rabbi Akiva, metu, they died in this period, and the Gemara even says it was a askara, it was a type of epidemic, like a coronavirus. It was something that brought down the Chachmei Yisrael, and not just Chachmei Yisrael, 24,000 Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva. It says 12,000 zugim, which is zugot, 12,000 pairs, chavrutot, of Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara never says that it's a period of mourning. It just says that between Pesach and Atzeret, which is Shavuot, this is what happened. It develops later in history that people didn't make weddings. That's how it starts. People didn't make weddings in this period. In the days of the Middle Ages, in Ashkenaz, after the pogroms of 1096, and where many of them were blood libel related and were between Pesach and Shavuot, so they were upgraded. The level of period of mourning or expression of mourning was upgraded in Ashkenaz. So there you have many more strict observances of Chumrot, of Ashkenazim. In the Sfardim it's less, but the Yemenites zero, because they go according to the Rambam, and it's just not there at all. Going to the Yemenites, you can get married any day you want between Pesach and Shavuot, not a problem, and so on. So what kind of epidemic was it? Epidemic. What's the difference? You might try to identify. Except that if you look at the letter of Rav Shrira Gaon, let's identify who he is. Shin Reish Yud Reish Aleph. Shrira Gaon. He's the father of somebody even more famous, Rav Hai Gaon, Hey Aleph Yud, one of the most famous of the Geonim. So the Geonim is the 6th century to the 10th, 11th century. So Rav Hai Gaon is just a known persona in the world of halacha. He actually authored books, Sfarim, in halacha, and he's quoted all the time. His father, Rav Shira Gaon, who's also known, and here and there shows up in the anthologies of responsa literature of the Geonim, Chuvot of Rav Shira Gaon, he writes a letter, Igeret Rav Shira Gaon. He was asked a simple question. How was the Mishnah and how was the Gemara written? It was a historical question, basically. Who are the people? What happened? And those two simple questions, the Mishnah and the Gemara, it's a book, he writes. The Igeret Rav Shira Gaon is a book. It's marketed today as a book. There are scholarly editions of it because there's sometimes different variants of the Igeret Rav Shira Gaon. And what he does is, he gives us the history of the Tanaim and the Amoraim and the Geonim, which means there was a period of 400 or 500 years that were dark ages. We didn't know anything. We didn't know who, what, when, Surah, Pumpadita, where were the yeshivot, who were the Rosh Yeshiva, what were they doing, who wrote anything. If not for the Igeret Rav Shira Gaon, we'd know nothing, and now we know something. I'll give an example. Somebody said once that when it said about the Rambam, Mi Moshe ad Moshe lo kam ke Moshe, from Moshe Rabbeinu to the Rambam, no one was as great as the Rambam. And the Rambam never saw that line, but 100 years after the Rambam, it was already in use. Mi Moshe ad Moshe lo kam ke Moshe. So somebody wanted to say a pshat that, did you ever notice that there's not one Tana in the Mishnah, not one Amorah in the Gemara who's called Moshe? We have all kinds of names, which means, and in Tanakh, after Moshe Rabbeinu, there are no personalities in Tanakh named Moshe, and nothing even remotely close. So you see, they didn't ever use the name Moshe until the Rambam. That's what it means, Moshe ad Moshe lo kam ke Moshe. The problem is it's wrong. You have to be careful when you make these things, and because in the Igeret Rav Shira Gaon, he names one of the Gaonim as Rabbeinu Moshe Gaon. So there was a Moshe Gaon in the 6th or 7th or 8th century in the yeshivot in Baghdad, which was then the seat of the Gaonut at the time. And so Moshe Gaon existed. But Rav Shira Gaon writes about the period of Rabbi Akiva and the Bar Kokhba revolution. He lets us know that the students of Rabbi Akiva died in the Shmad. Now what was the Shmad? The Shmad was the war. It was the war against Rome, was the revolt, which means they were Talmidim, students of Rabbi Akiva, and they were soldiers of Bar Kokhba. You know what that means? That the first Yeshivat Hesder wasn't Rav Goldvich's Yeshivat Kerem B'Yavne in 1954, but it was Rabbi Akiva's yeshiva, none other than Bnei Brak, where he was the Rav. Right? Rabbi Akiva was the Marad Adler in Bnei Brak at the time. So Bnei Brak, of all places, the seat of the Punovich yeshiva today, was the first Yeshivat Hesder. It had a yeshiva where all the Talmidim were battle ready, trained and ready. You think the revolt broke out, and now let's start training soldiers. Now, I'm going to say something, don't get me wrong. I was very happy that unfortunately, after the war broke out in Simchat Torah, so we started hearing about certain yeshiva boys from the Haredi circles that wanted to be trained. Kol hakavod, kol hakavod. But I got news for you, those soldiers aren't ready yet for battle. They might be ready, in 2 years or in a year, but they weren't ready yet in October, November, for sure not. It takes time. I have a grandson, my first grandson. He's now a chayal. Wow. He's in the tank, in the Shiryon. But he's not going to go into Gaza yet, but if we go into Lebanon in a few months, he might see action there. You need time to train the soldiers. So it means Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim were trained. They went into battle immediately. And the question that the Gemara asks in Masechet Yevamot, Daf Samach Bet, says, why did the Talmidim Rabbi Akiva die? They died because Shelo Nahagu Kavod Zu Lazu. They didn't respect each other. So what is the Gemara really telling us? Rabbi Akiva thought that Bar Kokhba was Mashiach. He actually said, he gave drashot, Darach Kochav Miyakov, in Parshat Balak, Zu Bar Kuziba. This is Shimon ben Kuziba, who is known as Bar Kokhba because of this drashah, Darach Kochav Miyakov. He was the great star. Bar Kuziba, he came from Kaziv, and that's why he's called Bar Kuziba. And Rabbi Akiva thought for sure he was Mashiach. And Rabbi Akiva convinces other Chachamim that he's Mashiach. And what Chazal were teaching us, that to try to understand the calamity and the collapse of the Bar Kokhba revolution has to do with answering the question. Rabbi Akiva had to answer the question. If the second Beit HaMikdash came about because of sinat chinam, Jews just didn't like the other one for no reason. Chinam means no reason. It's not that the guy did me wrong in business, so I don't like him. That's perfectly understandable. But no reason. I don't like the way he looks. I don't like his nose. I don't like his name. I don't like whatever. Whatever. I don't like his his couscous. I don't like the guy. Sinat chinam. No reason whatsoever not to like another Jew. So that brought down the Churban, the Beit HaMikdash. So if that's the case, if you think Bar Kokhba is Mashiach, and we're now moving towards the third Beit HaMikdash, and this is 65 years after the destruction, right? And Rabbi Akiva felt that the first Galut was 70 years, and now we're almost 70 years, so we're going to see the end of the Galut of Rome by the end of the 70th year. He had to answer, did we solve the problem of Sinat Chinam? But if Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva, and this is like the cream of the crop, I was going to say Harvard, but I'm not going to say that anymore. This is the cream of the crop. If they didn't have respect for one another, what do you expect for the person on the street? What kind of example are they showing to others? So this had no chance of becoming Yemot HaMashiach. And it collapses. And according to Rav Shura Gaon, the students of Rabbi Akiva fell as Chayalei Bar Kokhba. And that was the Shmad. It had nothing to do with a disease. It wasn't a corona. It wasn't anything else. It was a shmad. And he says it, shmada. It was a shmad, mamash. And why didn't the Gemara write it? Why did they write that it was an epidemic? This is called censorship. It was internally censored. We didn't want to broadcast the fact that there was a revolt against Rome because Rome was still on the scene. And the rebellion against Rome was so painful for Rome. Forget about it was painful to us. It was a disaster for us. Total disaster for us. But it was painful for Rome. And we know this because whenever in the history of Roman warfare, the Roman general succeeded, as he was supposed to do, he came back to the Senate in Rome and began a speech. And he reported. The opening line was, I and my army are at peace, something of this language. I and my army are okay or fine or peace, which means everything's fine. The only time that this report was delivered to the Senate without that opening line was after the Bar Kokhba revolution, because he and his army were not well at all. At all. They were also beaten. And because of that, it was politically incorrect to broadcast and publicize the revolution. So therefore, the students died conveniently in a magefa, in an epidemic. So this is an unbelievable example of censorship, which we have in the Talmud Bavli over and over again. Yeah?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you just said, that they died not in a magefa.
Right, they were killed. They fell by the Romans in the war.
They were fighting.
Of course they were fighting. They were fighting for Rabbi Akiva, for Bar Kokhba. It was the revolt against Rome.
So what does it mean that they didn't have respect one for another? Maybe they
So,
didn't train. Maybe
okay, so there your imagination can go wild, but I can tell you that I think I have an idea, at least an example. Thank God I was blessed in my years in the Rabbanut that I didn't really have this. I think every shul rabbi has people in shul who are Talmidei Chachamim as part of their crowd, less Talmidei Chachamim, total ignoramuses, Amaratzim, whatever. You have to love them all, and you have to talk to all of them, and fine. And you can give shiurim on different levels too, or you oscillate as you give your shir or drasha or whatever. I have friends who are in the Rabbanut who told me that the minute they get up, they also had, sometimes let's say a retired rabbi who's davening in the shul as a member. The minute he got up to say a drasha, either this rabbi picked himself up and walked out, or he opened up a sefer, a real tzaddik. What message was he giving to the people sitting around him? What this man has to say up there is just useless. I can do better. And there are some who do this. That's called shelo nagu kavod zu zu. That's what it means. That's a good example. And it's very sad, but it's an ego thing. It's an ego thing. If you have a Rav, look, I'm not going to tap myself on the shoulder, but I had a predecessor at Ol Nechama, Rabbi Danny Tropper, who was a Rav there for almost 30 years, and he sat for every drasha that I gave, and I learned from him, and now I have a new rabbi there, and I'm a balabas, and I sit for every drasha the rabbi gives, fine. Irrespective of what I could be saying and doing, it has nothing to do with it. Somebody else is up there, he's the Rav, he's the Morad Adra, you have Derech Eretz. That's called Nahagu Kavod Zu B'Zu.
That's called being a gentleman.
It's called being a mensch.
Right.
My grandfather Shalom used to say that in the Siddur, where it says Lo'olam Yehei Adam Yerei Shamayim, it says Lo'olam Yehei Adam Yerei Shamayim B'Seiter U'Vagalui. You should always be God-fearing in public and in private. So my grandfather used to put the comma. We talked about where the comma goes. Lo'olam Yehei Adam. First you should be a mensch. Then we'll talk about Yirat Shamayim. Before we get to being God-fearing, first you should be a mensch. Then we'll talk. It's not the pshat, but it's perfect. It's really perfect. So the Rambam said, La mishumadim al tehi tikva. So who are the mishumadim? Who are mishumadim? Well, this is the early Hebrew Christians. The early Hebrew Christians were Jews who were observing Torah mitzvot. The first generation or two of Christianity, it wasn't Christianity the way we see it today. It was a sect of Judaism, of sorts, who accepted Yeshu as Mashiach. And he was here. And when he was executed, there'll be a second coming. He's coming back, and so on. But these are people who are very, very religious, would go to the mikveh all the time. That's why baptism became a very, very big thing. You go to the Jordan River, by Yericho, because tefillah was very important. And they were very, very, religious in the sense of being scrupulous about halakha and so on. And that's what troubled Chachamim. What troubled Chachamim was they look Jewish, they smell Jewish, but they're not, because they have moved themselves out of the fold. But it was difficult, or bordering on impossible, to deal with this. Because you have a minyan in shul, 10 people, maybe one of them is in his heart is a Hebrew Christian. And what did Chazal call the Hebrew Christians? Minim. Minim. And it comes from the word min. Who are you? Just like it says man, lo yada mahu. They didn't know what it was. Said min, lo yada mihu. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know who he was. He was unidentifiable. And we couldn't deal with it. So in the days of Rabban Gamliel, who was the Nasi of the Sanhedrin, they instituted a 19th bracha in Shmona Esrei that God should pick up the tab and eradicate them. Can you imagine? What are we talking about? Eradicating a group of Am Yisrael. That's what we're doing. Tashbileim, tachniim, to eradicate. Shoveh oivim umachnia zedim, total annihilate them. We can't do anything about them. So who are they? They were a major danger for the future of Am Yisrael. V'la meshumadim al tehi tikva. How did we ultimately conquer the concept of the shmad of the early Christians? So this has to do with, and I'm referring now to another great Talmud Chacham and scholar, Shneir Leiman from Yale University, big Talmud Chacham. And he wrote about the fast of the 9th of Tevet. The 9th of Tevet. What happened on the 9th of Tevet? I know about the 10th of Tevet. It's a fast day. But the Shulchan Aruch, it says something about a fast of the 9th of Tevet. So what happened? Lo noda ezet tzara erubo. We don't know what happened on that day. I'm telling you, when you see a line like that, the word censorship just blurts out. Am Yisrael, we may forget things because that's who we are at our age. Where did I put the keys, right? So you don't have to feel bad. It happens to all of us. We forget things. We all forget things, right? The malach hashikacha, fine, that we forget. But Am Yisrael doesn't forget anything. The national memory of Am Yisrael, we are a nation of Zachor. 10 things we remember. To say that there's a fast in the calendar on the 9th of Tevet, and we don't have a clue what happened. Lo noda ezet tzara ubo. That's a quote out of Shulchan Aruch. We didn't know. What do you mean we didn't? So Shneor Lyman writes a whole shtickle. It's based on a hypothesis where the person who suggested the hypothesis wasn't 100% right, but at least was barking up the right tree. And he tries to demonstrate that if today it's 2024 in the secular calendar, which means what is year 1, is the beginning of the Christian era, right? The phrase BCE actually means before the Christian era, even though today we say before the common era, because sometimes people don't like to use the word Christian. So, but it's CE, the common era, and before the common era, fine. So, like we say today, before COVID, after COVID, before 9/11, after 9/11, right? Before October 7th, after October 7th. So there are markers, historic markers there. So, what is year 1? Christianity takes over. So it unfolds, and so on. So he makes a cheshbon that 2024 years ago, the 9th of Tevet fell out on December 25th. December 25th, ring a bell? And he says that this was the fast. It was the fast for Chag HaMolad. That we fasted on the day that the Christians have as a festival, as a Yom Tov, because we suffered so throughout the ages from Christianity. Now, I actually try to work it out, and it comes out. It actually works out. But Shneor Lyman says that's not really what it is. But this fellow was barking up the right tree that has something to do with Christianity, and he says something even more remarkable. The trick that Chazal used to try to derail Christianity from Judaism was to plant one of ours into the hierarchy of leadership of the Catholic Church. And they took somebody whose name was Shimon Kafia, who later becomes known as Saint Peter. He ultimately becomes the Pope. And his job was to sacrifice himself as a Jew and to become a Christian and to somehow move Christianity away from mainstream traditional Judaism. For example, the movement of Shabbat from the 7th day to Sunday was done by Peter. That's major. That is major, that the day of Sabbath is not Shabbat, Saturday, but it's on Sunday. The idea that there's no need any longer to observe the laws of Kashrut because they were just Beit HaMikdash concerns. I mean, the Reformed Jews took this as well. And therefore, there's no need. So you don't have to keep kosher anymore. And basically, you don't have to keep the rituals of Torah. You just have to keep the social side of Torah. That's it. But not the rituals of Torah. So this ultimately causes the derailment of Christianity from bona fide, authentic Judaism. And it works. And this Shimon ben Kifa, or Kifa, Kaf Yud Pei Aleph, is a known persona. He dies when? On the 9th of Tevet. And Am Yisrael decides to observe his Yartzeit in his honor for the heroism of sacrificing his life as a Jew to preserve Am Yisrael. It's an amazing story. So and Professor Lyman brings a much supportive material to show that this is exactly what happened. So it's going to blow you away completely. Put your seatbelts on, because I know somebody's going to fall off their chair now. According to some, this Shimon Kifa or Ben Kifa is the author of Nishmat Kol Chai that we say every Shabbos morning at the end of Psukei Zimra. That's unbelievable. Now, it's not 100% sure. It's not 100% sure. I actually went to Rabbeinu Google Shlita, right? And some say that Nishmat was authored by Anshe Knesset Gdolah, and they bring some sources, some Ashkenazi sources, the Machzeh Vitri, which is a siddur of Rashi's students. And some say that it was authored by somebody by the name of Yitzchak, whose wife was Rivka. And what is the indication? Because we know that poetry in liturgy, usually somehow they sign off by using either the Aleph Bet or their own name, right? V'fi Yisharim Titalal. So there's a Yud, Yisharim. So I'm going to do it now according to Nusach Sfard, because it's going to work out well. V'fi Yisharim Tit Romam, Uvsifsei tzadikim, the tzadik, titbarech. Uvelishon chasidim, the chet is the chet. Uvekerev kiddoshim, yitgat, you have a kuf. You have yud, tzadik, chet, kuf, yitzchak. But then you have Befi Yisharim Tit Romam, the Reish of Tit Romam, Uvseikat Tzadikim Tit Barach, the Bet, Uvishon Chasidim Tit Kadash, the Kuf, Uvekerev Kedoshim Tit Halal, the Hey, Rivka. So you have Yitzchak and Rivka. And the idea was that B'schut Yitzchak and Rivka, we're now going to daven, but their names were Yitzchak married to a Rivka. And so that's, now, it's also possible that it's dual authorship. That part of Nishmat, because Nishmat starts Nishmat Kol Chai, and it ends with, right before, Yishtabach. Sheken chovat kol ha'yitzurim, lefanech Hashem Elokeinu Elokeinu, leodot la'alel shebech l'far l'zod, al kol divrei shirot tishbachot, David ben Yishai, avdecha, mishichecha. And then comes Yishtabach. Nusach Sfard says, uvechein Yishtabach, but that's not part of it. That was like just a bridge, uvechein Yishtabach. And therefore, Yishtabach Shemcha. Yishtabach is independent. We say it in the morning without any uvecheins. Fine. So the some say that at some point in the middle of Nishmat ends the authorship of Shimon ben Kafia, and this Yitzchak married to Rivka take over afterwards. And where do you know this from? We know this from the fact that there's a reference to the name Shimon as well, but it's reverse order. Now, reverse order is also a technique. On Shabbat morning, follow the reverse alphabet as I go. From Taf, Shin, Reish, Kuf. Tikanta Shabbat Ratzita Korbanoteha, Tzivita Perusheha, Im Sidurei Nisacheha, Me'angeha Lolam Kavod Yinchalu, Toamea Chayim Zachu, Vegam Hoavim Devareha, Gidula Bacharu, Az. What comes afterwards? Misinai, so in Ashkenaz, Nitztavu. In Nusach Sfard, Az Misinai, Tzivui Pa'aleha Karaui. Those are all the end letters of Mem, Kaf, right? Nun, right? Az Misinai, Mem, Tzivui Pa'aleha Karaui. You have all this Ostiot Sofiot. So you have, that's probably the correct version, but what you have in Nusach Sfard. Nusach Ashkenaz, it's corrupted, but that's okay. We corrupt a lot of things. But it's the backwards alphabet. It's called Tashrak, Tav Shin Reish Kuf. So this you have. In the word, in the Nishmat Kol Chai, it jumps backwards from the Shin of Sholchein Ad, the Mem of Miyid Melach, the Ayin of Adheina Azarunu, the Vav of Ve'ilu Finu Malei Shira, and Nun of Nishmat. So you have the name Shimon in reverse order from the end of the poem to the beginning. It's interesting. It's interesting. So there's a possibility that Shimon, but there are some who say it's the Tana or pre-Tana, Shimon ben Shetach. Maybe it was authored by Shimon ben Shetach. So we don't know exactly who authored the Nishmat. According to one version, it was written by this Shimon ben Kifa, and he writes it as he's leaving Am Yisrael and giving a gift to Am Yisrael and basically saying goodbye. Very tragic, no? But he's a Gibor. He gave up his neshama. He gave up his neshama. You know, he was a Gibor Lumi. If Lyman, Shneur Lyman is correct on this, this is the Gibor Ultimativi. I mean, it was the ultimate Gibor, for sure. You have the whole scenario of Jewish children being saved by Christian families in Poland during the Shoah. It's a topic in itself. Rav Oshri Zatzal from the Shelot Uchuvot Mimamakim deals with this issue in Kovna. Is it permissible or not? It's a whole shiur in itself. And you're allowed to do it, but a lot of people did it. Some of those Jewish children were ultimately reclaimed, and many were not, and grew up as Christians. One grows up as a Christian, and he in a very religious Christian Catholic family, and he goes to theological school and becomes a galach, becomes a priest, becomes a bishop. He could have become the Pope. He was a candidate. He became the cardinal in Paris. Became the cardinal in Paris, and I'm talking about Lustiger, Cardinal Lustiger. Cardinal Lustiger has a brother who lives in Tel Aviv, has a second cousin, Arnold Lustiger from New Jersey, who wrote the Rav's books. Can you imagine? Wonderful Talmid Chacham. Wonderful Talmid Chacham. Put out a lot of the Rav's for him. And this Cardinal Lustiger, my friends in Oil Nechama, who come from Paris, reported to me that once a year, Cardinal Lustiger, in civilian clothing, comes to shul to say Kaddish for the yahrzeit of his father. This man was a candidate to be the Pope of Rome. The Pope in Rome. Can you imagine? And he still didn't forget his Jewish heritage and felt that because of Kibbud Av that he had to say Kaddish. And he didn't come in his, garb. I'll digress. I mean, Dr. Belkin, Zechron Levracha, the second president of Yeshiva University, was once at a dinner with Cardinal Cushing from New York City. And they're sitting together, and because there was Jewish leaders in... What? Cushing was... so Boston, so it was Cardinal Spellman. So they were sitting together at this dinner, and because there was also Jewish leaders and national leaders and religious leaders, the whole dinner was kosher. So Cardinal Spellman tells Dr. Belkin, they were sitting next to each other, he says, isn't this wonderful, the spirit of the ecumenical council, the two of us sitting together at a kosher meal? So Dr. Belkin says, there's only one difference. He says, you're wearing a red yarmulke and your institution's in the black. I'm wearing a black yarmulke and my institution's in the red. I heard this from Rabbi Louis Bernstein, Zechron Levracha. He told us this, Maisa. So you have this possibility of Shimon Kifa authoring the Nishmat Kol Chai. And you know what you have in Nishmat Kol Chai? Among other things, towards the end of it, where it says, Mi itmalach, mi yishvalach, mi arachlach, hakel, hagadol, hagibor, vanora, el elyon, konei shamayim va'aretz. Okay? Hakel, hagadol, hagibor, vanora, kel elyon, konei shamayim va'aretz. Now, in the continuation, you have these, what you have now is basically what Moshe Rabbeinu says as being the introducing the Shem Hashem in kinuyim, in nicknames. By Moshe Rabbeinu, you have it in Sefer Dvarim, Parshat Ekev, Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibov, and Ara. Now, I already mentioned that the whole Gemara some of that in the Anshe Knesset Gdolah, they restored Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibov, and Ara, but Daniel didn't want to say it, and Yecheskel didn't want to say it because Kadosh Baruch Hu was trampling on the Mikdash, and Am Yisrael was in Sarot. Is a Kadosh Baruch Hu really Norah? Is he really Gibor? But finally, the Anshe Knesset Gdolah restored it all, and Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibov, and Norah. Fine. So we have that in our Shmon Esrei. Where do you have El Elyon Konei Shemayim V'Aretz? Where is that from? It's in the Chumash. It's by Avraham Avinu. It's with Malki Tzedek Melech Shalem. It says, El Elyon Konei Shemayim V'Aretz. Mamash. God is the exalted, the creator, the Konei, the owner of Shemayim V'Aretz. Okay, so we have in the continuation of Nishmat all of these forms. Hakel b'ta'atzumot uzecha, Hagadol b'chvod shemecha, Hagibor lanetzach v'hanora b'norotecha. And then there's Hamelech, because in Shmon Esrei we have Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, v'hanora, and then Melech, Ozer, Mashiach, Magen. So the poem takes into consideration these nicknames of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, all in preparation of Tefillah. I mean, this is still part of Psukei de Zimra. You don't get to Chakras till after Baruch Hu. So this is the tail end of Psukei de Zimra on Shabbat and Yom Tov of this Nishmat Tefillah. So Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, v'hanora, El Elyon, Konei Shemayim V'Aretz. What does it say in our Shmon Esrei? Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, v'hanora, Kel Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim v'Konei Hakol. That's what it says in our Shmon Esrei. And Rav Shperva shows that the original nusach of Birkat Avot was Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, v'hanora, El Elyon, Konei Shemayim V'Aretz. Not Gomel Chasadim Tovim v'Konei Hakol. And the question is, why was it changed? And there are two places that it wasn't changed. It was never changed in Nishmat. We still say it. Ke'el Hagadol, Hagibor, v'hanora, El Elyon, Konei Shemayim V'Aretz. And Friday night, after Shmon Esrei, we have Bracha Achat Me'in Sheva, where it's like an abbreviated something, and the Chazan says, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu Elokei Avotenu, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, Hakel HaGadol, L'Gibor V'Nara, Kel Hayon, Koinei Shamayim V'Aretz, and we say Magen Avot. Now that's not a bona fide Chazarat HaShatz. The Chazan doesn't have to have his feet together, and does not bow down by Baruch atah Hashem. The Rav of Yerushalayim, Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, wrote old tshuva about this, that it's just a zeicha to Shmona Esrei, but just for latecomers who come to shul, but it's not a Chazarat HaShatz at all, and it doesn't have the brachot afterwards. It just ends Mekadesh Shabbat, and then the Chazan says Kaddish, and that's the end of that. So therefore, you don't have to. The Chazan doesn't have to ceremoniously bow by Baruch atah Hashem. It's not a bracha at all. So it's Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu. So there, we still preserved the old nusach, and apparently there was no reason to change the main nusach. So why was the main nusach changed? First of all, the main nusach was more famous than the Friday night or the Nishmat Kol Chai, and there was a reason that the censors changed it. Because there's a medrash in Parshat Lech Lecha on Kel Elyon Konei Shemayim Va'aretz that refers to Avram Avinu. That Avram Avinu, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave Avram Avinu kinyan, ownership, as if he created the world. Ooh, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu has partners. Look at that. And Christianity, there's the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost, right? The Ava Ben Baruch HaKodesh. So there's partnership. Why does the Rambam believe that Christianity is idolatry, avodah zarah, as opposed to Islam? Because of the Trinity. This is the Trinity. He felt it's called avodah zarah b'shituf. Shituf means partnership. So if you think that a Kadosh Baruch Hu is there, absolutely, but there are other powers in the world that control, the Rambam says that's avodah zarah. And that's why he was against astrology. Astrology. The Rambam makes a big difference between astronomy, the study of the celestial bodies. The Rambam says it's a mitzvah to study astronomy. And astrology, he says it's avodah zarah. If you look in Hilchot Avodah Zarah, Perek Yud Aleph, he says it clearly. Astrology believes avodah zarah. Of course, there were many who disagreed with the Rambam on this, like the Ramban. The Ramban says astrology is a koach. It just doesn't affect Am Yisrael. It affects the goyim. It affects the goyim, but not us. We're beyond astrology. But he believed that there was some koach in astrology. Rambam says it's complete falsehood, and it's avodah zarah. But so to think that there's Kadosh Baruch Hu and this partnership, the mere thinking of it, because that's not what Chazal meant when they said that Avraham Avinu has ownership, like let's use the word in the stock market, shares in the created world. So he's like a creator. It's like Keilu, he's like a creator. But they never meant to say that Kadosh Baruch Hu created the world, that Avraham Avinu created the world. They never meant to say that. But you can easily enough slip on this one. So they said, let's get that Konei Shemayim V'Aretz out of the tefillah. So instead of just saying, Kel Elyon Konei Hakol, Konei Hakol, God owns everything, they wanted to separate the Konei from the description of a Kadosh Baruch Hu, from the biblical description of Kel Elyon. So they threw in Gomel Chasadim Tovim. So Gomel Chasadim Tovim causes a hefsek, causes an interruption. V'konei hakol, right? And there were some who had the girsa konei hakol, not v'konei hakol. It's something else. Konei hakol. But we say v'konei hakol. But this is fascinating that you have this nusach, Kel Elyon. So Hakel HaGadol L'Gibor V'Norah is from Moshe Rabbeinu. Kel Elyon Konei Shemayim V'Aretz comes out of Avram Avinu's page. And then come the censors and distort it deliberately so that nobody should make a mistake. And this is what happens if you look at source number 7 again, Lamal Shinim, not the Mishumadim. Get that word Mishumad out. Get that word out. Because the word Shmad is going to remind the Romans what happened, because they knew the word that we were using. And that's why there are many Midrashim. Talked about Christianity, Yud Shin Vav is Yeshu, and they changed the Yud and they wrote an ayin. So now it's not Yeshu, it's Esav. It's a drasha about Esav. It's for Sudash Lishit on Parshat Vayetze, Vayishlach. We didn't mean you guys. We didn't mean you. It's something else. Don't get nervous. And why was this happening? Because the Christians took converts, Meshumadim, and they brought them to the Vatican, and you know that they stole, you know, manuscripts of Sifrei Kodesh and brought them to Rome, and had Jewish converts go over them who knew the material. They were B'nai Torah, right? And to highlight the anti-Christian things, and this would be a good reason for a pogrom, because they were very moral people, the Christians, and they needed some solid basis to kill Jews. So they had to do that. That's why it was dangerous to have these things in the writings, and that's why they were changed. And that's why one of the great sources of Jewish texts that were before the censorship got their way in the printing is the Vatican. And in 1963, Pope John the 24th, or 23rd or 24th, I don't remember already, and he was the one who invited Jewish scholars to come to Rome, the Ecumenical Council, invited Chachmei Israel to check out these books. And you can photograph them, you can do a microfilm of it, can't take it out, but you can microfilm it. And there are many, many Sifrei Kodesh in America, here in Eretz Yisrael, that were published based on the corrected texts that were found in the Vatican. We're still waiting for the Klei Kodesh of the Beit HaMikdash. Yeah, okay, that, right? Gemara says that Rabbi Yossi, one of the Tanaim, he said, "Ani iti baromi," Gemara Masechet Sukkot Daf Hey, and I saw the tzitz of the Kohen Gadol, and it says Kodesh Lashem straight, because there was a machloket if the Lamed and the Shem Hashem was a little higher than the Kodesh. And he said, no, I saw it. It's one line. I saw it with my own eyes. And Rav Lau Sr. was at the Pope, at Pope John Paul II, and he said, "Can I see the tzitz?" "No, I'm sorry, we don't have anything." He just didn't want to agree.
Maybe better.
But
Maybe it's better.
maybe it's better. Yeah. You know, it was Yeshayahu Leibowitz who once said, you know, belief of the Yemot HaMashiach period is one of the most essential beliefs in Am Yisrael. But oy vavoy if it happens. That was Yeshayahu Leibowitz, but I do not subscribe to that line at all. Okay, so we touched the subject of censorship, and next week we'll maybe touch a little bit more, but then go on some other topic. Okay.